Hi, I'm Nooriyah. I work at Nessie as a research communities advisor. Welcome to the webinar. We are talking about moving data to and from the Nessie cluster. So I'm going to try and share my presentation here. So I'm assuming everyone can hear me all right. If you can't, please let me know. And also, just before I begin, I want to quickly introduce a few people in the room. So we have Megan here, who everyone knows has organized the conference. And we have Callum here. Callum, do you want to say hi? He's in Nessie's application support specialist, and he has all the technical know-hows and might be better suited to answer your questions, like the technical questions. And so he might jump in and out while I talk. Now you know why. And we have Alex Splitzer here from Nessie as well. Hello, Alex. And Alex is in the computational science team and also very technically sound. So just sort of a disclaimer, I'm not a computer scientist or anything. I was a new user at Nessie a couple of years ago, and these were some of the tips and tricks I learned along the way trying to get my data on and off Nessie, and I thought this might be helpful to other users as well. Cool, and now I'll finally share my screen. Right. So, cool. Can you all see this? Yep. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about moving data to and from Nessie, and specifically talking about one method called secure copy. Just giving you an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to quickly go through getting started on Nessie, just in case you haven't already got a project or aren't already logged in on the cluster. I'm just going to point you to the relevant links, and Megan's going to make them available in the chat, so you can just link to them right now. And then I'll talk a little bit about files and directories, which will move us into finding your file paths. And then I'm going to talk about different methods of moving data, some of the tips and tricks to note that I've learned along the way. And lastly, I'll just demo a data transfer. And then we'll have some time for a question and answer session. And I think that the other Nessie staff here, like Callum and Alex, would be really helpful. Cool. So to get started on Nessie, there are a couple of steps required to get started on Nessie. You'd need to get an account on Nessie. And so as you can see, there are links here, and I can see Megan typing those into the chat as we speak. You can then request a project or an allocation to actually start your project. And then you can set up a password and a two-factor authentication, which will help you log into the cluster. And lastly, you will be required to set up your terminal so that you can, with your SSH configuration, so you can then SSH into Mahuika straight away. And I will show you what I mean in the demo a little bit as well. Just moving quickly on to files and directories. I don't know how many of you are familiar with navigating the file system in the command line. If you are, that's great. If you aren't, this is just a little intro to how to navigate your file system. So, oh, sorry, I've lost my mouse. Okay, it would be nice if I had a. Okay. sorry. Okay, there we go. So this here is basically showing you a tree-like structure of what your files would look like on your laptop. Obviously, the names of the directories would be quite different, but as an example, so this would be the root of your tree, which is your root directory, which is where you start all your command line navigations to your file paths. And then from your root directory, you can navigate into directories like etc, dev, home, user, and var in this example. And as you can see here, inside directory home, we have 3 more directories, and inside directory user, we just have 1 directory. And the other directories do not have any subdirectories in them. And then inside this directory journal, we've got work and photos. So if you would like to navigate, if you've just logged into, opened your terminal window on your laptop, and you would like to, if this is what your file system looked like, and I'd like to navigate to the folder called lib, I would basically, I would basically use the command cd or change directory and point to the directory users from root. So root is just a slash, and then you tell it to go into directory user, and through user, we can move into directory lib, right? So that's how I would navigate into this directory here. Once you're in this directory, how would you find your way to the directory called home, right? So once you're in this directory, I would change directory, and this double full stop basically means it will move 1 step up in your tree, in your directory tree. And so it's, if I say cd full stop, that's going to take me back to user. And I want to go 1 more step back to my root directory, because that is how I can get to home. There is no connection between user and home. And so I'd move back up into root, and I would then change directory and go from my root to the home directory. So this was just a little primer on how we're getting to the file paths that I will mention later on. Right, so once you're on the Nessie, once you're logged into Nessie, how would you navigate your way around, right? So when you log into Nessie, if you type pwd or print working directory, the first thing you'll see is your home directory, right? So that will be just home and your username. And once you've applied for an allocation or a project, you should have a project ID, such as mine here. So my project ID here is Nessie 99999. So yours would probably be your institution and a set of numbers. So if I want to navigate my way into my project directory on Nessie, once I log in, I'd change directories and go to Nessie, project, and then your project ID that you would have gotten after you've requested after your allocation has been accepted. Then there's something called a no backup directory on Nessie, and to navigate into the no backup directory, you would have to change directories into Nessie, no backup, and once again, your project ID, right? So I'll just quickly go through the differences between these 2 directories. So your project directory is one that's going to be continuously backed up, and that's data that you won't lose in the short term, right? So while your allocation and project is active, this data is going to be backed up, and you'd have previous versions of this data available to you upon request. Whereas the no backup directory, it has no limit on the disk space, so you can put large data files on it. But point to note is that this data can be lost or will be deleted after a certain time. So if there's some data that you don't want to lose at any cost, I recommend you put it in project directory. But if there's data like intermediary files that are quite large when you run your applications, or just raw data that you have a personal copy of, then you can just load that onto the no backup directory, because that has more disk space than your project directory. So that's just a bit about the NeSI's files, like your NeSI file paths that you will need. Right, so now coming to the point, moving data. To start any project, you probably want to move data to the cluster and from the cluster to your local machine or a hard drive or your institution's cluster. So there are two ways to do this. There is Secure Copy and Globus. I believe a colleague of mine gave a webinar on Globus last month. But I'm just going to go through very quickly just the differences between these two. So generally, Secure Copy is used, SCP, or what we're going to talk about today, is generally used for smaller data transfers. And it is quite it does not require too much of a setup on your local machine if you want to do a one-off transfer or just, do a quick transfer. So you can just quickly transfer it from your laptop or a local hard drive, or even your institution's cluster. But if you would like to transfer large amounts of data from your institutional cluster onto NeSI, it is much faster to do it via Globus. And Globus has a prerequisite, so you'd need to set up a personal endpoint to be able to do the file transfers. But once you set it up, you're good to go. And Globus is much easier to share data. On Globus, it's much easier to share data with collaborators. So if they're not NeSI users or cannot log on to NeSI, it's much easier to share data through Globus. Whereas on Secure Copy, once you copy your data onto your project directory and your collaborators are working in the same project directory, you can make that data visible to them on NeSI. Right, so I think that I'm gonna go straight into the demo, and I'm gonna go through these tips one at a time while I do the demo, but they're just written here, so when the slides are available to you, you can have a read of them later on. Cool. So hopefully I can get this going. Right, so just taking you a few steps back to what I said about setting up your terminal. To set up your terminal, there's a link that Megan's put up in the chat. To set up your terminal, you'd need to create an SSH configuration file. So that would be under oh, sorry, I probably make this bigger. Is that better? Cool. Right. So the SSH configuration file would look something like this. And so you'd have to copy exactly the same thing, and it's on the support page, on NeSI support pages. And all you'd need to do is change this username to your username. And once you've done that, you're all set. So what this lets you do is I can now type in SSH space Mahuika, and this will log me in. So if you're logging in for the first time, it will ask for your password and your two-factor authentication, your two-factor token. So now what this does is it's taken me straight to the Mahuika cluster, right? And so where am I? Once I log into this, where am I? If you do print working directory, right? This is where I am. This is called my home directory. I don't want to copy anything in my home directory. There is not a lot of disk space, and I won't be able to do a lot of computation if I copy any data in my home directory. So it's recommended that we now navigate to our project directory. So like I said earlier, our project directory is basically Nessie project and your project ID that you would have gotten. Mine is Nessie and 5 nines. Sorry. And now, if you notice, this has now changed to Nessie 999, which means that I am now in this directory, right? So it's recommended. So now comes the tip. On Nessie, we would recommend that once you've logged into Mahuika on one terminal window, right, you open a new terminal window to now copy your data. What this does is this will avoid you having to type in your password and your two-factor authentication every time you do a data transfer. So I'll show you what I mean. Now, here we go. I'm just gonna make this bigger. Right, so I'm in Mahuika and it's running on another terminal. And now here, I'm going to try and do a copy. Was there a question? Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm gonna do SCP, right? And I'm going to, on my machine, sorry, demos can always be daunting. So SCP always works by mentioning where you want, or where are you getting your data from, and to where you want it to go. So I want my data from my home directory on my desktop, right? So this is my file path that I'm entering now. This is a shortcut for your home directory. From my home directory, I now navigated onto my desktop, right? From on my desktop, I've got a folder called Data Transfer Webinar, right? And in there, I've got a file called Overview and Sampling, right? This is just a bad file name, and that's why you see all these slashes, but it is recommended that you don't have a ton of spaces and special characters in your file name. It'll just make it easier for you to do the data transfer. So this is where I want, this is the source, right? And now the destination, where do I want this data to go, right? So I want it to go on Mahuika. The reason I can just write Mahuika is because we've set up our SSH configuration. So all of those things will be dealt with by that config file. And so all I have to say is Mahuika, colon, and then I will enter my destination, which is basically my project directory on Nessie, right? And now because I'm already logged into Mahuika, this hopefully will not ask me for my password. So it'll just take a second, right? And so it's done. So this single file has now been transferred from my desktop, from this folder here, into Nessie, my project folder in Nessie on Mahuika. And another tip here, I recommend that you don't close your terminal once you've run this command and you wait for this 100%, right? So once this is done and once you see this prompt, that's when you are okay to close your terminal. And because I've done this before, I've closed my terminal too early and half my file was transferred and half was not. So yeah, just a tip for you. Right, so this simple SCP command can transfer a single file from this folder into Mahuika. And now what if we have, okay, sorry. And now what if we have a bunch of files in a folder, right? And we want to transfer that entire folder onto Mahuika. All we need to do is SCP and the -R flag. So what this does, it recursively copies each file in my folder onto Mahuika. So now the -R flag, right? And once again, my source is the same, but this time I'm not going to give it a file name. I'm just going to say transfer this entire directory. But this flag is the key. So if you don't have this, it's going to show you an error message. And so I want to transfer this directory now once again onto Mahuika, into my project directory, right? So what this should do is show you the progress of each file in this directory being transferred onto your project directory in Mahuika. Cool. Right, so it's almost done, not yet. I would have closed the window, but don't close this terminal window or it won't be completed. Right, now that I see this prompt, it's okay to close this terminal window and your transfer is complete. Now, just to double check that we have actually transferred our files and see the files in our destination folder, which is your project directory once again, I'm just going to type ls on the Mahuika platform, right, in my project directory. And yes, I see data transfer webinar, which has been transferred here. Now let's see if everything from that folder has been transferred. Sorry, so I'm just using tab to autocomplete the command. And now, here we go. So all my files are now in here. Now, a good way to check that you have done this correctly is also checking the size of your files. So for every, so I mean, if you have a lot of files, this is probably not the best way to check it, but here we go. So now these were all my folders on my desktop, all my files on my desktop in the data transfer webinar folder, and now I see them on in my project directory on Mahuika, right? So success, SCP worked. Now, what if I want, so yeah, what if I don't put in this -R flag here? I'm just going to show you. It's not going to be able to transfer anything because this is a directory and it's not a file. So for a directory, please don't forget the -R flag. Cool. Just going back to my presentation. So these were just some of the tips that I mentioned. Logging into Mahuika on a separate terminal window before the transfer will just make the process smoother for you. So you won't have to enter your password and do the authentication all over again and again. So, and also, please don't close your terminal window too soon. And to evaluate a successful transfer, if you don't have too many files, you can quite easily check the file size and make sure that the file size on your source and your destination folder are the same. Cool. That was it for me. The floor is now open to questions, and we also have, you can also contact support at Nessie if you have any sort of particular questions while logging in, or just going through the workflows. And this webinar material is recorded and slides will be available. Yeah, thank you. Any questions?
So there's one in the chat. Is the command similar for transferring files from Mahuika to desktop?
Actually, good point. I should have shown that too. And I'm going to do that now. The command is similar, except you just have to switch them around. So I'm just going to quickly show you. Great question. Thank you. Right. So what I did here is I transferred from my desktop to Mahuika. All I need to do now is just flip this around. So now Mahuika becomes my source and my destination becomes this folder here, or my desktop, or wherever you want to transfer it. So say I want to transfer it to my desktop, right? Into, yeah, just desktop, and then from my Mahuika. So the key is SCP -R from this address to this address. And so once you remember the from and the to in the right order, you should be able to transfer from anywhere to anywhere. So now I'm taking this same folder, the folder called, oh, sorry, data transfer webinar, and popping it onto my desktop. Yeah, let's hope this works. Yes, success. So now I've transferred files from Mahuika, from my project directory, whatever folder I choose, into my local laptop, my desktop.
I think it's worth pointing out again that you always have to run this SPC command in a local terminal, because that term Mahuika colon, that's defined in your config file. So if you run that command from the cluster, it won't know what you're talking about. It won't know what Mahuika means. So just make sure that's always from a local terminal.
Correct. It's very important to note that we are logged into Mahuika, but it's on a separate terminal window. And we are running the command on my local terminal. I'm not logged into Mahuika when I run the command.
And you can see the prompt's different. So this one is Wi-Fi staff. Do you want to compare the two prompts?
Yes. Yeah. Give me a minute. I seem to have lost my mouse. Sorry. I'm gonna do it again. Right, so if you see the prompt here is Wi-Fi staff and my name. So this is my laptop, and the prompt here is actually my username at Mahuika and my project ID. So they're quite different, and the commands need to be run on my local terminal when I'm not logged into, where I'm not logged into Mahuika. And here I'm logged into Mahuika, and I don't run the secure copy commands in here. Cool.
There's also another question in the chat. What would be the best way to transfer very large files, greater than 100 gigabytes?
I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Callum and Alex, I think that you can transfer 100 gigabytes using secure copy, but doing it via Globus would be more, I guess, streamlined. You'd be able to use the GUI, you won't have to wait too long. Callum, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, 100 gigabytes is fine in SCP, but it sort of depends what, if it's lots of files, because just got to, think about what would happen if the connection breaks. If there are lots of little files, then that's fine. But if it's one big file that's 100 gigabytes, there's, a reasonable chance the connection might get interrupted. And that's somewhere where you might want to consider using something like Globus or just another application that caches it on either side, so you can continue that transfer if it broke halfway. But yeah, generally, like we say for Globus, it's normally like a terabyte-ish on a semi-regular basis before it's worthwhile. Well, I mean, it's really up to you, but.
Yeah, and Denise put a link to the support documentation for data transfer using Globus in case you need to. Cool. Any other questions?
There was one. I think it was still about transferring larger amounts of data. So let me just I'll read the question again though. Large data files. What is the size of data pipe into Nessie? Is there a risk of saturating the link when transferring terabytes of data?
Yeah, so I guess that's the other advantage with Globus. So I don't have the numbers in my head, but the Globus transfer would actually happen through DTN nodes without going into the details. They would be separate nodes, so that has the advantage of not affecting other users who might actually be connecting to the to our platforms. So I would definitely say that once you reach perhaps 100 gigabytes or you're going above, certainly in the terabyte regime, you probably really want to seriously consider Globus because that would not only be much faster for you as a user, it comes at an extra little cost of complexity, but it does also help other users who would actually not be affected by the data transfer. I hope that answers the question. So I don't have exactly the, if somebody has the numbers, we could probably search for it on somewhere what the pipeline is. But the main message here is that going through Globus, if your files are really big, and going through Globus would also help other users.
Oops. The pipe is about 200 gigabits a second. So you're not going to saturate that. Or you'd have to be trying really hard.
So is that using Globus, Callum?
No, that's just using that's just our connection to the REANS network.
Oh, right.
If you're from any institution, but Globus, yeah, Globus uses different. I'm not an expert on Globus, but I believe it uses different things.
But that would be shared. So I guess the other users, that pipe has to be shared amongst the users. And that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, so like I said, there are a few ways to do it. And if you have much larger data sets, and there is a risk of the connection breaking up and then your files being incomplete. So in that case, something like Globus would be really helpful, and we're happy to help, but that's sort of outside of the scope of this demo.
So can you hear me? It was me who
Yes.
asked the question. Yeah, I've been tasked with transferring about 35 terabytes of data down to down here for backup purposes and stuff. So I'm not familiar with Globus. Is Globus a GUI that allows you to? And is there a throttling function on there so you can do large amounts of data over a large period of time?
Yeah, so there is a web interface. There is something called globus.org. One has to sign up. Then we have basically a node. We have a Nessie node, which we can then access. You can just find it. And you need to create a node for the other side, for the other endpoint as well. So whether it's University of Otago, I guess you have one, or some other, basically the source or the destination of your transfer.
Yeah,
so
I'm at Lancair Research.
Lancair,
yeah, I
yeah,
think they're in the process of creating a
setting that
data
up.
node in our Palmerston North office, and we've got a 10 gig link from where I'm in Lincoln to there. But it's yeah, I'm not sure where they're at with that. So.
Yeah, I guess it's that's we all moving towards that. I think this protocol. I think it's very popular. It allows people to share very large data sets across the world. So it's definitely a good option. It's probably the only option I would think of. In addition to the SCP command, which is simpler, and it's definitely the first step for smaller data sets. I mean, Globus would also check the sanity of the files. And I guess you had a question about the throttling. So what happens is that it would run the transfer in the background in parallel, and then it sends you an email when the data are ready. So if it may take maybe 5-10 minutes or longer, so you don't actually have to sit and in front of a terminal and just watch that number rise slowly to 100%.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
And just so everyone knows, I'm adding all these links that are flying around in the chat to that Google Docs that I have just posted again. So if you're hectic, like frantically trying to keep tabs on all these things, it's all in that sheet.
I guess one question I have, because I'm also using a Mac just like Nooriyah, but for Windows users, is there anything special they have to do, Nooriyah, in order to type the SCP command?
They have to get something that's not Windows.
What do you mean, Callum?
If they want to use SCP that same way, they have to use a Linux subsystem. So either use the one that's in Windows, the new one that's in Windows, or actually just install a VM. Otherwise, if you're on Windows, you'll be using another application like MobaXterm or WinSCP, which doesn't handle SCP in the same way. You can't set up a config file like that.
So I guess there are two parts, right, in that question. I mean, the first one is the SCP command has to be available, so everything dependent on that SCP command to be there, and that SCP command can exist either in MobaXterm or perhaps in POTI or some other application could support that command. And then the second aspect is the configuration. The .ssh/config file, which is really separate and is a convenience. So even if people don't have that, because MobaXterm doesn't work exactly the same way or doesn't have an equivalent file, they can still use the SCP. It's just that they're going to have to type in the password.
But the thing is that with the Windows applications, you're generally not actually typing in SCP. It's done with a GUI sort of abstraction.
So SCP has a graphical user interface as well.
Well, with all the Windows ones, you will not be typing in SCP. You'll be dragging files or entering into fields or that sort of thing.
I mean, there's a Git bash, right? Which there could be some.
Yeah, there's lots of command line programs you can use, but you can't, or we haven't figured out a way of setting up multiplexing without having the Linux environment as well, which is why we recommend the Ubuntu LTS terminal, because that's got an actual subsystem in it. Did you want to talk to about that?
Yeah, so basically what we're saying is if you have Windows 10 and you have an Ubuntu subsystem, then you can basically do all these things, right? That were described, correct, Calum?
Yeah. If you have the subsystem, everything is as Nooriyah has just shown. But if you're using another application like MobaXterm or WinSCP or PuTTY, it will be completely different. But there's a lot of problems with those applications, so we generally recommend you set up Ubuntu terminal. We've got it described in that link that's been posted there, because then it's standard with what you do in Linux and Mac.
Cool, thank you. Were there any, so Megan, I think you had a question.
Yeah, so it's a kind of clarifying what we went through. So when we say we're transferring data, we're making a copy from our local machine to NeSI, correct? And when we transfer off NeSI, we're writing a copy to our local machine. Is that correct?
Yes, you got it right. So it's a copy. You'd still have a copy somewhere, like in the original folder.
Cool. So a copy stays in the project directory and is backed up and everything. Cool. Okay.
If it's in the project directory, it's backed up. If it's in no backup, like the name suggests, it's not backed up and it might just disappear.
Right. Perfect.
And just a correction on that transfer speed number I gave. It's more like 10 gigabits a second, not whatever figure, not whatever number I gave, but still that's a lot of bandwidth.
Okay. Cool. Any last minute questions? Did we manage to help you? Sorry, I don't know your name. Fox R? Where are you from?
Yeah, Robert Fox.
Rob. Okay, cool.
MWL Lanka Research. Yes, I did. Yeah, I'm going to be setting up a network SMB connection to an external data source, and I was thinking it might be just as easy to set up some sort of connection directly from that to the NeSI directory and copy the data that way rather than come through us. Yeah, okay, no, it's plenty of food for thought, but yeah, it looks like Globus might be the way forward for us.
Great. Awesome. Right. Cool. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. Megan, did we have any last minute things?
I don't think so, other than if you registered for this webinar, I'll be sending through a follow-up email that will have a link to the recording and to the slides. So everything you need should be in there, but thank you all for coming.
Cool. Thank you.
Bye, guys.